And now it is my privilege to be hosting Dr. Wendy Ward, who will delve into the role of diet in maintaining bone health, particularly as we age. Dr. Ward is a professor and senior research fellow at Brock University in beautiful St. Catharines, Ontario, Niagara region, wonderful part of the province of Ontario. She has made significant strides in understanding the role of nutrition in bone health. In addition to her research, Dr. Ward serves as the editor-in-chief for the journal Applied Physiology, Nutrition, and Metabolism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Ward as she shares her cutting-edge research and insights into the vital role of diet in promoting and sustaining bone health. Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank the McCaig Institute and the Wood Forum. And we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about foods and diet, which is just sort of the other part of talking about activity when we think about those lifestyle factors that can influence our bone health. So we're going to talk about eating well for healthy, strong bones. So when I think about how do we eat well, or how do we eat a balanced diet, or what does a balanced diet even refer to, I think the best resource we have is to look at our Canada's Food Guide and our Eat Well plate. And you'll all be familiar with this. Our food guide's been redone many times, and this is the most recent version that came out in early 2019. And so there's three main focuses of the food guide which help us to eat well. And the first aspect is to have plenty of fruits and vegetables. And when they say plenty, they mean plenty. And they mean half of our plate should be fruits and vegetables at each of our meals, or if we're having a smoothie bowl, whatever you're eating off of should be about half fruits and vegetables. One of the other key aspects is to eat protein foods, and that should be representing about a quarter of our plate. It's very interesting with our last food guide, and it certainly wasn't without controversy, when there was a lot of emphasis on plant foods as well. So we can keep that in mind as we go through this talk. The third aspect that's critical is that other quarter of our plate should be choosing whole grain foods. So those are things to keep in mind when we're eating for health overall. When we're eating for our bone health, again, we want to think about foods first, that foods first approach. But now it gets a bit more complicated because we have a lot of information about calcium and vitamin D and even protein, that those nutrients are very important for our bone health. And now we have to think about, well, what foods are those in? Or what are our best choices that we can eat? And protein is sort of the more emerging nutrient in terms of bone health. We know a lot about protein and muscle health, and activity level as well, and the benefits there. And there's a lot of discussion right now in terms of bone health, in terms of amount that's needed, and also source, whether it's animal foods or plant-based foods or mixtures of both that can help us eat well for our bone health. So let's talk first about calcium. And again, one of the themes you'll hear coming through as I'm speaking today is I'm very much in favor of that foods first approach. So thinking about the food guide, then thinking about the foods we can consume that are rich sources of these bone supporting nutrients. So when it comes to calcium, we have various options of the foods we can eat. Some are naturally rich in calcium, like our cheeses, cow's milk-based yogurt, and even things like canned salmon. I couldn't find a good photo of the tin of salmon, so pretend that salmon's canned with the bones, because that's where the calcium is. We also have calcium-fortified foods. So we've got a lot of plant-based beverages that many individuals are consuming. And also the green yogurt containers I've put there to represent plant-based yogurts as well. And then orange juice can sometimes be fortified with calcium as well. So we have lots of options out there, and a lot of the images that I've shown you here are what we would call best sources of calcium. And that's really just referring to the amount, that those are the highest levels of calcium in those foods that we can get through our food supply. And that's why here I've broken it down to best sources as containing 300 milligrams of calcium or more. Good sources are about 200 milligrams of calcium, and then sources are about 100 milligrams of calcium as well. And I followed along with the pamphlet that's been put in your bag today, that's been developed by Alberta Health Services, which breaks down and gives you different examples of those foods and the levels of calcium in them. There's also a great resource on the website of Osteoporosis Canada. So Brent just mentioned about the Too Fit to Fracture guidelines. There's also something called the calcium calculator on that same website, where you can enter what you eat during the day, and it will calculate how much calcium you're getting. So in terms of best sources of calcium, it's a lot of these images of these foods that are representing that. So cow's milk, your fortified plant-based beverages, your yogurts, some cheeses will have that high level of calcium. The tinned salmon would be more in the 200 milligram calcium level, and then orange juice would be between 1 and 200. So there's some kind of simple ways that you can estimate how much calcium you need. And in terms of men, between 50 and 70 years, you need 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day. This increases a little bit to 1,200 milligrams as you age, simply because we're losing more mineral from our bones with age. And so that dietary recommended intake is increasing. For women age 51 and older, we require that higher level of 1,200 milligrams because we start to lose our bone at an earlier age compared to men. So if we keep that 1,200 milligram number in our mind, then we can kind of roughly calculate how much we're getting during the day. So if we look over on this side, we see something here about 300 milligrams per day from calcium intake from eating a variety of foods. You'll remember earlier I said there's a lot of different foods that contain calcium. The issue is those foods can contain very small amounts of calcium, but together, by eating a varied diet, you're getting about 300 milligrams of calcium per day just by eating and living. And then what we can do is go on and look at our other sources. So in this scenario, I've put down that we're having 3 of our best sources of calcium. So that might be a serving of yogurt, a serving of cow's milk, and maybe some cheese. So by doing that, we're getting another 900 milligrams of calcium. Combine that with the 300 from our varied diet, and we're at 1,200 milligrams. So we're doing well for and meeting our needs for calcium for the day. But there can be different scenarios as well. And of course, everybody's got their unique ways that they're eating and consuming their calcium. So if we've got the 300 as the baseline, and then maybe there's one food source per day that an individual's eating. And then maybe they know they're not getting enough calcium in their diet, and they're taking a supplement at another 300 milligrams. But the total daily calcium intake is still only 900 milligrams per day. So in this kind of scenario, you might want to evaluate and say, you know, I've got to get closer to that 1,200 milligrams. How am I going to do it? Am I going to increase my supplement use, or am I going to try and incorporate more foods into my diet? So using different resources like the one in your brochure or in your bag, and also the calcium calculator, you can help to work through and figure out how to meet your calcium needs for the day. When we talk about vitamin D, this is one nutrient, and I always tell my undergraduate students here that this is one nutrient where you're going to have to take a supplement to get what you need for the day. And that's because few foods contain vitamin D. The few sources we have are really eggs, and it's mostly in the egg yolk, and there's a little bit in there, about 80 international units of vitamin D, or our fatty fish. And we're regularly not consuming a lot of the fatty fish to get vitamin D, but they are great sources if you do consume it. We also don't want to rely on sunlight to make our vitamin D. For a lot of us living in Canada, we can't make vitamin D even through skin production and exposure to the sun for 6 or more months of the year. And also we know that with the risk of skin cancer, it's not the best idea to be relying on that for your vitamin D. So this is where you're going to need to turn to supplements. We do have some fortified foods and beverages. So by law, our cow's milk, of course, contains vitamin D. And with the increase in fortification levels recently, milk is now containing 200 international units per day. But when we look over here at what our intake should be per day, so if we're 51 to 70 years, it should be 600 IUs per day, and up to 800 IUs per day if we're over age 70. That's a lot of servings of milk. Some of you might like your milk. I do like my milk, so I could get close to that. But we know that Health Canada has a recommendation that all of us age 50 and over, because of the scarcity of vitamin D in our food supply, should be taking a vitamin that has 400 international units of vitamin D per day to make sure that we're getting enough vitamin D. In terms of types of supplements, this is sometimes a question that comes up. We have the D3 form and the D2 form. So the D3 form is your animal-based form, and D2 is plant-based. And so there's often some concern about, should I take one over the other? Is one better than the other for bone health? And I think the latest data is still showing us that there's benefits from both sources. So if you are concerned and want to be choosing that plant-based form of vitamin D, that's okay. And you will see the benefits to bone and your serum vitamin D levels. So when we move to protein, again, we're using a foods first strategy. The dietary recommended intake for protein is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And this is for all ages. So whether you're a very young adult or whether you're an older adult, it's all the same. I've circled in a green box that 0.8 gram level because it really is a minimal amount. And when I talk to my colleagues that work with muscle and looking at protein needs, there's a lot of data and literature to support that probably higher levels of protein are needed to maintain muscle during aging and muscle function. And that's why I've put those higher levels of 1 and even maybe up to 1.3 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And that's just sort of to keep in mind that two things really, that there may be a benefit of these higher levels for muscle health, and also that, that muscle and bone are working together. And so we kind of have to respect both tissues. And that when we think about supporting muscle and balance and training, and that's been talked about in the previous talk a little bit, one of the things that muscle, or good training of our muscles can do is help us to prevent falls. And if we prevent those falls, we can also reduce the risk that we're going to fracture as well. So I just wanted to put some of those higher levels there just to keep in mind the role of protein for muscle health as well. But for bone, right now we work with this 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And there's a lot of active studies still ongoing about those levels. So if we're a body weight of 60 to 80 kilograms and using that 0.8 gram amount, we need to consume 48 to 64 grams of protein per day. And we can look at what that would look like for us. So it's a bit of a busy table with a lot of numbers, but I have grouped foods according to different characteristics. So at the top here we have chicken, steak, and ground beef. We have salmon, then we have some dairy foods, Greek yogurt and milk. I had to put peanut butter on because we do eat peanut butter, don't we, as Canadians? Eggs, and then I've grouped quinoa, beans, nuts, flaxseed, and I've also put the protein scoops, the pea and the whey protein down here as well. So we've grouped those different types of protein together. And maybe by grouping them, you're starting to think about, oh, okay, these probably have different levels of our bone-supporting nutrients as well, like calcium and vitamin D, and they can vary quite a lot. We're not talking about fiber and fatty acid profiles today, but that's another part of this conversation that can come out when we look at different types of protein as well. Because for certain health benefits or conditions, we might be wanting to increase fiber. We might be wanting to alter our fatty acid profile and maybe get more omega-3 fatty acids in our diet. And then what's active in our research program is looking at polyphenols and flavonoids. And of course, those are very much in plants and tea-based foods as well. But going back to our table, what I want to focus on is these protein levels in this column, and then the energy that's associated with this specific serving sizes for each of these types of protein. We'll move on and do some comparisons here. Because I think one thing you're probably noticing is that up at the top here, we have foods that are much greater sources of protein, and then it gets lower as we move down. And then the protein scoops, of course, have higher levels as well. But these different foods have varying levels of the protein. And what I wanted to look at in this slide is to compare the chicken, steak, ground beef, and the salmon. So when we compare these, we see that all 4 of these have very similar levels of protein. But what's really different is the salmon, especially if it's a canned or tinned salmon, is also going to have calcium because you've got the bones being broken up in there. You've also got a really good source of vitamin D in there. You've also got a different fat profile as well compared to the other meats. So it's kind of an interesting comparison that you've got the same level of protein, but you've got a different portfolio of these other bone-supporting nutrients as well. So when you're making decisions about how you're going to get your protein, these kinds of questions can enter into your decision making. Let's look at another comparison. So here we have Greek yogurt and milk. Of course, Greek yogurt's much higher in protein, so if you are looking to up your protein and you like yogurt, that's an easy way to do it. And then we compare it down lower to the quinoa, beans, nuts, and flaxseed group. Slightly lower or more in line with the levels of protein in milk here. You've got different energy levels, somewhat, not terribly different, but a main focus, or a main difference in terms of bone-supporting nutrients is this calcium and vitamin D levels that you're going to find in these dairy products versus different fat profiles and more fiber in these other options. So again, you're selecting your protein sources and you're going to get very different nutrient profiles accordingly. And the other thing is appetite can decrease as we age, and I see it in my own family members as well. And so making sure that you're getting enough protein can be really important. When I showed you that earlier diagram that showed the different levels of protein intake, a lot of us as Canadians, as middle-aged or slightly older adults, are still getting well over that 0.8 grams of protein per day. But as we age, it can get harder and harder to get that level of protein. And one of the reasons is because of our appetite changing quite a bit. So it's really important to ensure that the protein needs are met. And that might include more frequent snacking and being strategic about what foods we are snacking on, and maybe more frequent, just smaller meals as well. So the last, not a nutrient, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about caffeine, because I get a lot of questions about, do I have to give up my tea and my coffee, or both, or can I get away with a little bit? So I'd like to share this slide. For overall health, we have guidelines from the government that our caffeine intake shouldn't be higher than 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. And in terms of bone health, we are a little bit concerned about caffeine causing us to excrete more calcium, and that calcium is coming from our skeleton. So there can be a little bit of concern there. But what's been shown by the literature is that if we stay within these lower levels of caffeine intake, and we're also getting the recommended level of calcium in our diet, that the two are balancing each other out, and it's fine. And you can have a little bit of tea or coffee as well. I've put 5 different teacups up here in different colors just to show the different types of tea. So, green, black, white, oolong tea, they all contain about 45 to 50 milligrams of caffeine per serving. And keep in mind, this is a serving, this is a cup. And I know when we go and get our coffee and tea, it's often more than that serving, so keep that in mind. In comparison, coffee has about double the amount of tea in general. Of course, that's going to vary a little bit as well, but we can keep that in mind. So it's still okay to have, caffeine in the diet, provided you're getting enough calcium in your diet. And, a lot of people are drinking lattes, or they're adding a bit of milk to their coffee or their tea, and that's certainly going to provide some calcium that you might be excreting because of the caffeine there as well. And just a little bit about our own research that we're doing back at the university is we're looking more and more at tea polyphenols and links to positive effects on bone health. We don't have any cause and effect data at this point, but it's interesting the associations that are out there with these polyphenols that might be acting as antioxidants and maybe have some anti-inflammatory properties as well. And there's also some caffeine-free teas where you're still getting the polyphenols potentially that might be benefiting other aspects of health. So that's really an active area of research. And rooibos is a great example of a caffeine-free tea because it's from a different plant than our black and green and white tea. So just to summarize, you can eat well for your bone health, and I think it's not too difficult. You can strategize for it and figure out what you like, because I always tell people, if you don't like what's on your diet plan or your food plan, you're not going to eat it. So you have to make it so you like it. So keep in mind those 3 aspects of the Eat Well plate. Make it a habit to eat fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and protein foods at each meal. So think about the distribution of your plate, the half and the 2/4. Get your calcium from foods first, and supplement only if needed. Vitamin D from foods is great, but you're also probably going to need a supplement as well, especially if we're over age 50. And protein at each meal is really important as well. So a couple of resources. I've mentioned the calcium calculator on Osteoporosis Canada's website. There's also recipes and other resources that are coming online now. I also put together a curated list of websites. It's 3 pages long. It doesn't look that interesting, but there are some really helpful websites on there about Canada's food guides, some information from Dietitians of Canada as well, and other things. You also have a wonderful resource here done by Alberta Health Services called Am I Eating Well for My Bones? And that's been put in your package as well. And that will really help to guide your choices as well. I'd just like to close with what's in the little green box at the bottom too. And these were 4 tenets of the food guide. And this really resonated with me. I hadn't seen this kind of messaging before. That we should be mindful of our eating habits, we should cook more often, enjoy our food, and eat meals with others whenever we can. And I think that's just a nice holistic approach to healthy eating and overall health. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Wonderful reminders of how important it is to be mindful of what we put in our bodies. Well, today